Well, welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you all today. My name is Lisa Zook. I serve as the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives here at Chicago Theological Seminary, and happy to see so many of you joining us today. Just a reminder with a little Zoom etiquette. We will be recording today's session. We record all of these so that people can watch after the fact if they're not able to join us, or sometimes you might want to go back and listen again. They're available to watch after. They'll be posted on our website by the end of the day tomorrow. So feel free to share with friends, but also by being here in this space, you're giving your consent to be recorded. So just keep that in mind that we are recording this. Also, you came into the room automatically on mute. We ask that you keep yourself on mute unless you are speaking. There will be time during our session today for question and answers with our presenters. But until such time, please keep yourself on mute so that we can hear our speakers clearly. Also encourage you to open up your chat window, click that little speech bubble in the bottom of your screen. Feel free to message individuals that you might want to say hi to, shout out to, and also drop comments in the chat in running time. So we'll all be keeping an eye on that, but it's a great way for us to engage together on this platform. Friends, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Chicago Theological Seminary resides on the traditional territories of the three fire peoples, the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lakes region at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821. This area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land we now occupy, living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence and support Indigenous communities' struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. For those of you not in Chicago or the Chicago area, if you know the names of the Indigenous peoples who originally lived on your land, I encourage you to add those names and locations to the chat as we all commit to this work. I also want to take time to note that today our Jewish friends are observing Yom Kippur. I offer wishes for a meaningful fast for those observing and wish La Shana Tova, a good year to all. As we begin our time together, we've invited one of our students, Triki Fernandez-Caberto, to bring words of gathering to draw us into this space. So Triki, I'll turn to you now.
Thank you for inviting me to speak. There are many kinds of Hinduisms and therefore many kinds of Hindus. My name is Triki, I'm 27 years old and I'm from Hawaii, and I'm a Shaivite Hindu. I'm currently in preparation for formal initiation with my local sampradaya. This process will take 2 years to complete. So hopefully by the time I graduate from CTS with a master's degree, I'll also be recognized as a devotee of my guru. The Kauai Hindu monastery traces their lineage back to the Tamil-speaking regions of South India and Sri Lanka, where Satguru Yogaswami lived. Yogaswami's successor was a white American known as Shivaya Subramania Swami, or as his disciples called him, Gurudeva. Before his death, Yogaswami instructed Gurudeva to bridge the gap between the East and the West. And Gurudeva in 1970 did just that by founding a temple in Hawaii. He founded the Kauai Adhinam, a beacon of Shaiva Siddhanta. Gurudeva said this regarding the philosophy of his spiritual lineage. The primary goal of monastic Shaivism is realizing one's identity with Lord Shiva in perfect union and non-differentiation. Self-realization may be attained in this life, granting moksha, permanent liberation from the cycles of birth and death. Many people ask me, how do you become Hindu? To this I say, The only true way to identify a Hindu is by his or her actions. To be Hindu is to chant japa mantra daily in front of the home shrine. To be Hindu is to attend puja and darshan as much as you can. To be Hindu is to recognize that we are not separated from God, rather we all exist in and with God. Therefore, every living being on this planet is as sacred as you and I. The birds in the sky, the fish in the ocean, the lions in the savannah are all a reflection of Lord Shiva. Ahimsa, which means nonviolence, is a major tenet of Shaivism and the reason why I am vegetarian. I would like to simultaneously close my introduction and open this hour of listening by reciting a classic Sanskrit prayer, one that is recited before an event in which two parties exist, a student and a teacher. So I'll state the prayer in English for the sake of understanding, and then I'll do it in the traditional Vedic chant. May the Lord protect us both. May the Lord nourish us both. Let us create energy together. May our attainments be bright and brilliant. May we not have conflict. Om, peace, peace, peace. Again, thank you for letting me speak. I'll go ahead and close with the Vedic prayer. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvina Vaditamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you.
Thank you, Triki. Thank you for that. Wonderful, the words of context to help us understand a little more, and then for the words of invitation to bring us into this space in a spirit of peace. Very much appreciate you being with us today. So friends, as we get ready to welcome our speakers, I wanted to mention, first of all, our gatherings typically end at 1 o'clock on Wednesdays, but today we're going to actually extend our time until 1:30 for those of you who are able to stay, because I think today's conversation is going to be long and rich. I'm delighted to welcome you, and if you need to leave at 1 o'clock, we absolutely understand. So no one will take offense if you must go at 1 if you're here joining us on your lunch hour, have a meeting pressing after this. I'm delighted to welcome with us today my friend and colleague, Dr. Zachary Moon, who will be in conversation with Dr. Danielle Buhuro and Dr. Cody Sanders. Dr. Zachary Moon recently edited a new book. They are all contributors to this book. The book is Doing Theology in Pandemics, Facing Viruses, Violence, and Vitriol. And I'm going to go ahead and turn to you, Dr. Moon, to get us started.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, all of you, for blessing us by being here today. Obviously, today is a day of kind of particular celebration as we kind of welcome and acknowledge this particular publication. But I have to say, seeing many of your faces on my screen right now is a source of celebration for me. President Braxton, I'm going to smile every time I see you for quite a while, I think. It's so wonderful to have you a part of our community now. To my esteemed colleagues, to many of my favorite students who are smiling back at me, Angela Wilson, Chad O'Neill. These were some of my very first students here, and it's such a blessing to see all of you here today. I'm going to really sort of set this up by saying something that actually sometimes doesn't get said by academic folks talking about their books. But if you know me very well, you'll understand why it is that I'm saying these sort of cringeworthy, heretical sorts of things, which is from my perspective, the publishing of books that I am interested in is an expression of ministry. So let me say that again. The publishing of books is an expression of ministry. Now, again, if you spend time in higher ed, you can understand how that might be a little cringeworthy to some academic folks, right? You know, this is supposed to be, you know, this certain kind of performance of expertise, of scholarly intellect, right? At its kind of most pinnacle, right? And ministry is kind of a different thing altogether than what I just described. So when I share with you that this is my orientation about the writing and the publishing of books, I want to be clear with you, because this book could not really be celebrated if you were led to believe that this was an expression of the pinnacles of my scholarly intellect, certainly in any kind of isolated way, or even, I would say, the scholarly brilliance of a few individuals. You all who have been in this community with me know that my orientation of ministry itself is one that is deeply and fiercely relational. So in many ways, this book is the clearest expression of what I mean by this kind of writing as ministry, because this book is all about conversation. This book is all about community. It's all about inviting brilliance to gather together and to sit in deep consideration and deep reverence for the challenges that we are facing in this particular season of our life together. And while there is some particular national context to the perspectives that are here, we also realize that many of these dynamics are quite present in our global communities as well, not only with the public health catastrophe of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also dynamics that are spoken to in this text having to do with state-sponsored violence, the policing of certain bodies through surveillance, through policing practices and incarceration. We understand that these are not only American phenomena, but also global phenomena as well. And that the sorts of things that have been transpiring in our nation, in fact, have deep impact on our global neighbors as well as a part of this. But a little bit of background about this particular book. So I guess we're about 2.5 years into the COVID-19 pandemic. But as you all are well aware, things that were going on in our country over this last 2.5 years, again, have both direct relationship to this pandemic, but there have also been other things that have come to the surface in this time that I think have been very significant. And what was laid on my heart, particularly early in the pandemic, and as we came into that summer, that first summer of the pandemic, that was also very much marked by very visible and horrific instances of police violence against Black and brown bodies, and the subsequent resistance and response to that violence, all within a particular saturation point of particular kinds of very vicious political divisiveness and certain ideologies that were very clearly afoot to dehumanize and marginalize and subjugate certain persons, and I would say God's creation itself. So in the midst of that, what was laid on my heart is, well, what are we going to say about this? What do we have to do to resource the very real needs that are taking place in our communities right now today? And I realized very quickly as I started talking to folks about the possibility of doing a project like this, particularly talking to book publishers about this, I heard again and again publishers and other folks saying, well, you know, we won't really know the real significance of this time until 10 years or 15 or 20 years later. And this this sort of rattled me a little bit, because I said, well, I don't know if we have 10 or 15 or 20 years to mess around with here, because I happen to be in relationship with some communities who need some resources right now. They need to hear from some folks right now. They need to hear from some theologians, from some biblical scholars. They need to hear from some chaplains. They need to hear from some real visionary religious leaders in this time, because there is deep moral significance to what is happening in our world. And so where are those voices gonna have an opportunity to be taken seriously, to be given the platform that they need to be able to do that kind of resourcing? And so it was a great privilege to be able to utilize some generous grant making through the Henry Luce Foundation to actually, this project actually had sort of two faces. The one that was able to stand up more quickly was a series of videos. And if somebody doesn't beat me to it, I'll put the link to that whole series here in the chat in just a moment. Both Dr. Sanders and Dr. Buhuro and a number of other colleagues were each featured as a part of that. Books take much longer to get through the publication pipeline than getting together and doing some videos. So we got those videos out quick, and then we kept working with the material, kept working with this amazing community of scholars. And then the second phase of that was this book that we're having an opportunity to celebrate today. But very clearly, it wasn't that I would disagree that we'll understand some things 10 years from now that we don't understand now. I just think that theology without urgency maybe isn't really the kind of theology that we need to be investing in too much. And I think that's something that resonates probably with a CTS kind of perspective and understanding on this. But the folks who are really contributors into this book, this community project, are the kind of theologians who are wired like that, right? Who are committed like that, who say, yeah, we can do some good kind of retrospective kind of work, and that kind of remembering is a significant dimension, I think, of good theological work. But there's also some pressing issues here that we need to take seriously and earnestly, and we need to move with a sense of purpose and a sense of urgency. And so maybe some other books will get written 10 or 15 or 20 years from now. That's what some of those publishers told me. But we've got a book to celebrate today, and I'm really grateful to be able to share this space with Dr. Buhuro, with Dr. Sanders. Well, some of you probably already know them, but you might not know just how much I really love them, and I'm really inspired by them. So I'll just take this as a point of privilege to just declare my love for both of them. And I hope that all of you have an opportunity to learn with them and be inspired by them and fall in love with them as I have. So really our design for this time, a way to kind of engage a book that some of you may have seen and some of you may not have seen, is that we're going to give each of these phenomenal contributors an opportunity to talk a little bit with greater depth on their contribution, and then also hear from them a little bit about how they see this work continuing to evolve and develop, that their thinking didn't just get, finished up when the book came out, but I know that they're continuing to both intellectually and practically to wrestle with this and to be considerate of these themes and these challenges. So we'll have an opportunity to hear from each of them. And then this really is a time of community dialogue and engagement. There are so many pressing questions. And so I hope that we will get to be a kind of living resource to one another in community during this time. So if you've got some questions, let's definitely know that this is a good time to be able to embrace those questions together. So first, I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Buhuro, and if you would do two things for us, if you bless us with two things. One would be to really speak to, give us a sense of what your kind of particular contribution within the volume was. What were some of the particular questions or challenges and matters that you took up specifically with your contribution? And then I think the sort of second movement in that, Dr. Buhuro, would just be to ask sort of what is what is continuing to really hold your attention and your engagement during this time, as it pertains to this particular work that's represented in the volume, but also just into your work more generally speaking. You are engaged with a lot of communities and a lot of work, and we would love to kind of hear where those growing edges for you all are practically and intellectually speaking. So let me turn it to you, Dr. Buhuro, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Greetings, friends. So good to see you here on today. So good to see you, President Braxton. I am first thankful and honored by Dr. Moon inviting me to be a contributor to this wonderful, wonderful project. And so I am humbled and I am honored in these moments. And he said something to me a few days ago, and he asked me to keep it confidential, but I just need to say it out loud. And I apologize if it hurts anybody's feelings, but he officially let me know that I am his favorite student. So just want to let all of you all know that. Don't hate. don't hate. All right. So I am just very, very, very appreciative to have been a part of this project. The particular misery that I experienced during COVID-19 was that which I put to words as seeing bad theology go viral. I believe that the divine calls us to turn our misery into ministry. And so in some sense, this project I experienced as a wonderful opportunity to begin to really attack what I experienced as bad theology going viral at the onset and continuing throughout our pandemic. I began to wrestle with the misuse of a particular Christian biblical scripture. If my people who are called by my name will turn from their evil ways, then I will heal the land. And as I would log on to social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I noticed that this particular scripture would be taken out of context. I also noticed, in some sense, a dishonoring of all persons' feelings, meaning I started to observe going viral this notion that we should not be afraid of this COVID-19 pandemic. Our faith should be bigger than our fear, or we shouldn't have any fear at all. And so this became the second challenge that caused me misery, that I said, you know what? We have to attack this bad theology that's gone viral. We also have to attack, in some sense, this desire to dishonor parts of persons' being. And so I was very appreciative to contribute to this project for those two learnings. First and foremost, I wanted us to begin to, in the field of spiritual care in particular, re-examine what are the particular phrases that we are saying theologically about the divine during this time as it relates to COVID-19, and really think about that as we think about the provision of spiritual care. What does it mean if we tend to think about, reflect on, or theologically state that COVID-19 is a punishment? What does that mean, not only theologically in terms of oppressing folks, but psychologically oppressing persons? Second, what does it mean in some sense if we are to believe that persons should cut off parts of their being and only rest in peaceful, joyful, powerful feelings, and ignore their sad, mad, or scared feelings? A Christian pastoral and psychological therapist by the name of Gloria Wilcox created the feeling wheel and stated that there are 6 feelings that all persons experience, regardless of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, ableism, sexual orientation, or gender identity. All persons experience sad, mad, scared, peaceful, joyful, powerful. Those 6 feelings. You will later find various types of feeling wheel images that have been published that have gone viral on our internet, highlighting these feelings. A cool theological movie that was created a few years ago called Inside Out helped us understand or address that all persons experience 6 feelings, but for some reason, as we move from 2019 into 2020, there began to be a desire to theologically and psychologically push people to ignore the sad, mad, scared feelings as they're showing up related to this pandemic, and also fully just walk into peaceful, joyful, powerful. And I began to struggle with that as I saw such phrases as faith over fear going viral on my Facebook timeline, or let your quote unquote God be bigger than your fear. And so I began to really wrestle with, how do we really push back? How do we really push back against that and honor holistically all the feelings that people experience? Now, as a result of looking at those 2 phenomenons and really trying to create a response to those, a third dynamic arose for me and my thinking around this, and that is, how do we understand that it's time for the ministry of spiritual care to be re-envisioned? Often when we think about spiritual care or pastoral care or the field of chaplaincy, we primarily have thought about this field primarily related to issues around faith, theology, and spirituality. But I began to wrestle with a third dynamic. COVID-19, for many African-American persons in particular, was the 3rd or 4th pandemic that many persons of African descent began to wrestle with. The first pandemic that persons of African descent have found themselves in is racism, followed by sexism, followed by classism. And so I really began to highlight work from the Centers for Disease Control in 2019 and 2020 that began to show COVID-19, in some sense, propelled, doubled, or even tripled the already pre-existing pandemics that persons of African descent have had to grapple with. If you were to visit right now today, the Centers for Disease Control website, www.cdc.gov, and you were to type in their search engine, African American health, new research has shown that there are 5 pre-existing pandemics that African Americans have found themselves at the height of. Number 1, unemployment. Number 2, poverty. Number 3, lack of affordable housing. Number 4, chronic illnesses as a result of food insecurity. And number 5, inability to have access to adequate health care. COVID-19 seems to propel these already pre-existing sociological issues that African Americans have been victimized by. And so in some sense, I wanted to think about, how do we reimagine spiritual care as holistic care? Meaning, what does it look like to take serious that the role of a chaplain or spiritual care provider is not just to have theological conversations, not just to have conversations about faith and the divine, but have conversations around the social needs that many persons find themselves experiencing. Meaning, what does it mean for a chaplain or a spiritual care provider to do community needs assessments, to discover where are all of the social services that exist in communities that persons can connect with? So in some sense, I began to grapple with, how do we expand the definition of spiritual care to also take into consideration the provision of social services and social support? COVID-19 also revealed another dynamic or pandemic that many persons of African descent have wrestled with, and that is trauma. Since European slave masters arrived to the shores of Jamestown, Virginia, carrying African bodies that were kidnapped from Africa, we have yet to address the ways in which racism, African enslavement, the period of Jim Crow, and the civil rights movement have caused, in some sense, racialized trauma to persons of African descent. And so in some sense, I'm also proposing in this project that our spiritual care not only address the sociological needs that persons experience, but also the psychological or emotional needs that persons have, particularly African descent, have also experienced. Thereby, I am proposing that we move into spiritual care must also consider providing mental health first aid or psychological first aid. How do we begin to connect the dots between more than just simply talking about faith and theology? How do we not only provide sociological resources, but how do we also provide mental health first aid to persons that we encounter in a spiritual care moment? Last but not least, I also began to grapple with initially thinking about the ways in which bad theology has gone viral on social media, and initially thinking about the ways in which there's been some psychologically unhealthy hashtags that went viral on social media. I began to grapple with what are the ways in which online formatting, social media is the new space and place where spiritual care is needed at an all-time high. Much of my PhD work has been around thinking about what does spiritual care look like in digital space? How is digital space the new public sphere, if you will, for where spiritual care is needed? Because we're also starting to see, in some sense, the ways in which social media is having a huge impact on our lives, right? Social media, in some sense, is what many of us live by. Many of us bear our souls on Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram. Many of us look for affirmation. Many of us are looking for empathy on social media. And so I think moving forward, as this project progresses, one idea that we need to grapple with in the field of chaplaincy or spiritual care is what are the ways in which there needs to be a spiritual care methodology that is developed online via social media. And that is the new space and place where chaplains and spiritual care providers and pastoral care providers are called to serve. An example to that is, I have a friend. My friend's name is Deneen Collins. Deneen has a sister. I've never met Deneen's sister before. But when Deneen logs online and says, everybody wish my sister a happy birthday. I've never met Deneen's sister, but it is because of my relationship with Reverend Deneen that I say, all right, happy birthday, sister. I'm so glad. I'm so glad today is your birthday, right? How is doing that an act of pastoral care or spiritual care to Deneen's sister? And so that is the ways in which I'm really desiring the field of chaplaincy or spiritual care pushes forward. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Buhuro, getting us started here in this. And if you've got some particular questions, some things that are on your mind and on your heart coming out of this conversation, I think we can probably populate some questions in the chat, but we'll have an opportunity to get into the conversation here in a few minutes. But I want to give Dr. Sanders an opportunity to introduce his work to us a little bit, so we can also have that in our minds and in our hearts. And Dr. Sanders, I would ask just similarly of you, for you to get us oriented with your contribution in this collective project. And also, as we've just heard from Dr. Buhuro, a sense of what continues to grow and develop and emerge from your scholarship in this area, and other things that you would just want to resource this space with today before we turn to a collective conversation. Please.
Thanks so much. It's really good to be here with you. Good to be with several folks that I see from former classes that I've taught at CTS. Feels like coming to a space that is like home in some ways. I will start by giving you some context out of which this chapter emerged, because it really started before Dr. Moon invited us to consider writing these lectures and chapters. For me, the work that began to congeal around this topic of the apocalyptic emotions, or feeling our way through the apocalypse, as the chapter is titled, started in my congregation. I serve a congregation in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Old Cambridge Baptist Church. And it was probably about 4 or 5 months into the pandemic, summer of 2020, when I started to think really carefully about what I was encountering pastorally in the congregation and in my work with students at Harvard and MIT, in terms of the emotions that were being brought to the fore in the course of the pandemic, but more broadly than that, as we've already heard named, the aftermath of so much violence against Black and Brown people in this country, the practice of sanctuary with an undocumented family that my congregation had been involved with for, at that point, 4 years or so, all through the Trump administration. And just the general sense that we were living in an era that was characterized by many of the things that we have often called apocalyptic. And by apocalyptic, I didn't mean something like the capital E end of the world, but the end of the world as we know it, the ends and edges that many of us were feeling and facing with regard to democracy, with regard to the hundreds and thousands and eventually millions who would die from COVID, and the climate crisis. And my congregation in particular is really, really good at thinking about things really carefully and doing activistic justice work together. What doesn't often get brought to the surface is the way that our feelings and emotions are influencing and informing those things. So I wanted to focus some on that, and I did that in a couple of ways. One was to identify some of the particular emotions that were being brought up around these experiences that we were having collectively. And I kind of identified 3 emotions that I started to think of as apocalyptic emotions. And before I got to writing this chapter and lecture for Dr. Moon's collected work, this work started in a series of sermons back in 2020 with my congregation. And the 3 apocalyptic emotions that I started to work with were the emotions of fear and sadness and anger. And these, according to most evolutionary psychologists that study emotions, are 3 of the emotions that are sort of considered primary, the emotions that are rooted in our biology, controlled by subcortical regions of the brain. They're evolutionary gifts to us. They help us to survive our day-to-day lives. And they also serve to direct our attention in particular ways and to influence our perception and our cognition, and focus on certain things in our environment and not focus on other things. So I got to become really interested in how these apocalyptic emotions of fear, sadness, and anger were shaping our lives and our actions and our community during a time that felt like the end of the world as we knew it. And I also got to some real curiosity about what would happen or what is happening with these apocalyptic emotions if we don't attend to them in constructive pastoral ways. For example, I think that fear really prompts the question, if we can attend to fear collectively, how is my well-being or the well-being of the wider world that concerns me being put in danger? Fear is alerting us to something that we love and care about being in peril. Sadness, what important parts of my world feel like they are being irreparably damaged or lost? What is dying? Anger, how are my values of justice and survival and well-being and flourishing being threatened by all that is going on right now? Very important questions that are raised for us by these emotions of fear, sadness, and anger. But I got to look at how, if left unattended in any constructive pastoral way, these apocalyptic emotions can develop into longer lasting moods or dispositions toward life. And I was seeing that in a lot of what I was observing just sort of in the wider social sphere in relation to everything that was happening all through the Trump administration into the pandemic. So I'll just give you a little brief synopsis of what I think happens in that sense. I think fear, if left completely unattended, is not addressed communally, collectively, pastorally, can lead to longer lasting moods and dispositions of helplessness, of apathy, of immobilization in the face of what threatens us, and of isolation, cutting ourselves off from the communities that can care for us and hold us through those experiences. Sadness, if left unattended, can develop into longer lasting moods of despair, loss of meaning in life, a sense of numbness in the face of all that is dying that we hold close to us, and extreme fatigue for those who are doing the work of justice and care in the world, but who are not attending to their own feelings of sadness about all that's being threatened and damaged and lost. Anger, and we've seen this in some really palpable ways in our world. If left unattended, anger, I think, develops into longer lasting moods of resentment, of cynicism, of a dichotomous us versus them thinking, and even practices of vengefulness. So the chapter talks about how to work with those apocalyptic emotions of fear, sadness, and anger in the context of faith communities. But then it also moves into working with pastoral practitioners around how to cultivate certain emotional experiences, not just to work with the ones that are presenting, but to actually cultivate particular emotional experiences that have a buoying effect for communities that they serve. So these are not antidotes to fear, sadness, and anger. These are just additional emotional experiences that I think are really vital for the practice of care and for communities that are living through times that feel like the end of the world as they know it. I see these emotions serving the purpose of sort of connecting us to a sense of transcendence. That is both a transcendence to an ultimate context or God, but also a transcendence that moves us beyond our self into community with others, both human and more than human others in the world around us. And these three emotional experiences that I help people to think about how to nurture are the complex emotional experiences of gratitude, attending to what is giving my life a sense of gift, what is opening me toward the world around me, how are these gifts moving me toward giving something of myself for the good of others, the complex emotional experience of grief, asking what losses do we need to intentionally mourn and lament together, and who in our community needs to share in this work of grief. And then the third that I think is really important for faith communities, but is often really overlooked, is the emotional experience of wonder and provoking wonder with others, evoking a sense of awe and curiosity and deep interest in the world, experiences that lure us out of our sense of individual selves and into engagement with the wider world. And Dr. Buhuro talked about the kind of 6 primary emotions on the emotion wheel. When I was looking at wonder, hardly any psychologist thinks of wonder as an emotion, or at least not a primary emotion. But there's a 3rd century BCE Indian Sanskrit text that talks about the 9 basic emotions that were considered to be basic at the time. And wonder was one of these 9 emotions. And it kind of links wonder with the ritual act of seeing divinely. And if any of you are familiar with the work of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Heschel also saw wonder, what he talked about as radical amazement, as a chief characteristic of a religious orientation to the world. He talked about it as a perpetual surprise at the fact that there are facts at all. So that the second part of the chapter helps spiritual caregivers and faith community leaders to think about how not just to address the fear, anger, and sadness that they are experiencing with the congregations and communities they serve, but then to actually figure out how to provoke and promote experiences of gratitude and grief and wonder in ways that sustain communities through times that feel like the end of the world as they know it. Since that chapter, and since this work with the congregation, my congregation has gotten really into thinking apocalyptically, and I don't mean that in the sense that is typically used. We're not preparing our bunkers for the end of the world period, but we are thinking with the Christian tradition of apocalypticism, and how Catherine Keller talks about eschatology and the word eschatos having this literal meaning of edge, and so the endings and edges that we are facing in our life in the world right now, and how we can be a congregation that faithfully faces those endings and edges and works to sustain life in the midst of them. So I'll give you one example of how that developed recently. Every fall, we have a leadership retreat with our staff and our deacons and our team leaders and committee chairs. And this year, the moderator and I developed that leadership retreat around 3 scenarios. They were near future scenarios. We basically took the recipe of Octavia Butler, who said that she did not make up any problems that she wrote about in her parables books, for example. All she did was look at the problems that the world was facing around her and imagine what would happen if we didn't address any of those problems and gave them about 30 years to grow into real catastrophes. So that's what we did, except we did it in a 10-year time frame, and we focused it on the city of Cambridge. One of the scenarios developed some economic issues that we're facing right now as a country and as a community with an affordable housing crisis, and developed that scenario about 10 years into our future to imagine what Cambridge would be like then. One of those scenarios developed a political imagination of what would happen if Trumpism kind of took hold even more in this next election, and we were sent down a trajectory that we don't want to imagine, but that is not hard to imagine. And we developed that scenario out a bit to figure out what it would be like for LGBTQ people and women and racial and ethnic minorities and immigrants and the the wider web of life, and what it would be like to live in that world in which democracy was crumbling and the union was in peril and things of that nature. And the third scenario developed our climate situation that we're facing right now, just taking all the facts as we know them, not making up anything that is hard to imagine. I mean, just taking everything that we know is likely to happen in the next 10 years, developing that into a scenario that we would be facing in our context. And we divided up folks to work on these scenarios. I'll tell you, I was a bit nervous about this because, the congregation has lived through some really difficult times in the last few years. And I didn't know what would happen exactly if I gave them these scenarios that plunged them even deeper into the problems that we were already facing. And at first, there was a pall of silence over the room. One of the note takers wrote at the top of her notes, basically something like, the consensus of everyone was : dismal. But they split up into groups. They worked with these scenarios. They were asked questions like, who would become most vulnerable based on this scenario in the near future? What gifts and graces and assets as a congregation do we have that would be gifts to this near future? What capacities do we have to sustain life and work for justice in this near future? And how do we get from where we are now as a congregation to where we imagine we might need to be in order to be faithful in this 10-year near future? After about 15 or 20 minutes of working in those groups, I started hearing laughter, which made me wonder if they had abandoned the assignment. And so I went around to see if they were still talking about these dismal futures I gave them to talk about. And they were talking about those things. But, in this sense of, looking with gratitude at the gifts of the congregation and how those gifts could be leveraged in this near future, out of a deep sense of grief. I heard the grief going on, just examining these possibilities and imagining the losses that would be felt and the people who would be put in precarious situations. And the sense of wonder. I think that that came into it as well, in their capacity to somehow enjoy being with one another in community, facing this dismal near future. So that the work that started with this chapter has been developing in that trajectory, trying to think alongside this Christian tradition of apocalypticism, not imagining the end of the world, but the ends of the world as we know it, and figuring out what it means to be faithful in those near futures that we face.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. Appreciate your opening your work and sharing your work with us in these ways. I hope all of you have heard kind of affirmation of what this project is really about and really what we're meant to be about, I think, as a community during this time. While we are a community situated within higher education and theological education in particular, at least our orientation in this work is to be about that work that is applicable and urgent within our communities, and that's not just an intellectual endeavor, but that is a heart endeavor, that is a soul endeavor. It is, as both of these phenomenal educators have just shared with us, this is about our feelings, y'all. Let's get into our feelings a little bit. Let's not imagine that we're going to hang out in some kind of intellectual space where we don't have to attend to the real power of emotion and expression and our creatureliness, our humanness in the midst of that. So I hope you're hearing some of those connections. And I think I'll ask Lisa if you'll help to kind of facilitate this space. Certainly, we'd like to be kind of resources and responders to some of the questions and comments that may be emerging now from our community. Lisa, would you help us facilitate a little bit here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have time now, as I mentioned. We are going to allow our time together to go until 1:30 for those who are able to stay. So this is an opportunity to unmute yourself and ask a question, or to put a question in the chat. And I see that Dr. Braxton is leading us off with his hand raised. So Dr. Braxton, to you.
Thank you. Good day, one and all, and colleagues. What brilliant observations you have brought to us today. My question has to do with the movement through inappropriate, viral, bad theology to forms that are healthier. And so here's my question. How do we help communities avoid the premature or inauthentic celebration, but not also get stuck in lamentation? So there's movement that I'm interested in, and how does spiritual care, because my particular concern is that we, as many communities right now, are stuck in places of trauma without all of the resources to move us to authentic celebration, authentic joy, authentic gratitude. So I hope my question has enough of a fine point on it. And my question is rooted in deep gratitude for what you all have given to us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that question, President Braxton. A couple of dynamics for me as we think about this that I'm grappling with in hearing your question. One, I really do think that it's a both and. I think that we don't have to engage in either or. And so I'm excited to hear you talk about the both and. I think that until we spend enough time grappling with the sad, mad, and scared first, then we can shift and move into the joy. I think I am challenging a belief system in chaplaincy that says, oh, the role of a chaplain or a spiritual care provider is to shift people from sad, mad, scared to joy. And I want to see us sit in the pain for as long as we need to sit in the pain. I want to see us sit in the scare. I want to see us sit in the anger. And if I could even push back a bit and say, I don't necessarily believe that joy is the answer all the time. I think there are times when just sitting in sad, mad, scare is enough. And so I also am wrestling with this notion of, is joy the end result at all times? Or will there be some times when the lament alone is the space and place where we'll land on, where we'll end?
You talking good in here, doctor. You talking good.
At the same time, I do have to give a shout out and acknowledge the wonderful work of Dr. Joanne Terrell in Power in the Blood, and also thinking about what are the ways in which we could find subversive joy in the lament. And so I so appreciate Dr. Terrell's work around this, and that is the lament, the sad is sitting in the lament, and is the lament a space and place where we could also find subversive joy without necessarily shifting to joy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I really love that, those notions, and agree that premature movements to joy is not very helpful. But I would also question whether sometimes what we call joy is more related to an ideology or idolatry of progress and optimism rather than joy. I mean, in a real biblical sense, if you take the Psalms as an example, lament and joy are sort of alternating in some ways, and even more so in the book of Revelation. There is no linear progress to Revelation. It is what Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza talked about as a kaleidoscopic spiral, and we move from these really terrible moments of violence and pain and trauma to suddenly the host of heaven and angelic beings and the four creatures around the throne singing these joyful songs of rejoicing and praise. And it moves back and forth between those things constantly. And I think there's something to that movement that is helpful to look at in contradiction to what I think is a really, an American ideology or idolatry around progress and how that gets so mixed up in people's minds. I think especially white people's minds with the notion of joy or hope. I hear people talk about hope all the time in ways that I can clearly identify, and it's not hope. They're talking about optimism or progress. And the other two things that came to mind just really quickly is I work from a narrative therapeutic framework, and one of the narrative principles when working with someone in the midst of a lot of pain and trouble is to always take the opportunity to get to know the person outside of the problem's influence, because there's more to the person or to the community than the problem. It's not ignoring the problem, because that's the reason they're there in the therapeutic situation to begin with, but there is more to the person outside of the problem. I think that's really helpful as an orientation to working with people in the midst of problems that doesn't necessarily move into joy, but it sees a larger context. And the other that I have never forgotten since I heard her say it at this AAR session 10, 12 years ago, Katie Cannon was giving a talk about pedagogy. And she said something like, exposing people to all the problems that we face in the world without giving them any sense of what to do about it is a recipe for hopelessness. And I think we can get into that method sometimes in churches, especially, liberal, peace and justice oriented churches that want to expose all the problems, but helping people to figure out what to do, what they can do in relation to them, knowing that they're never going to be able to do enough and they're never going to be able to do it all on their own. And that whatever they do may, in the end, not avert the catastrophe that is to come. But I think this parallel that Cannon pointed to in pointing to the problems, but also helping people know how to relate to them constructively is an important piece of the question for me.
you all have taught today. You all have taught today. Thank you.
And at the same time, though, I also want to name that as you speak, President Braxton, I do hear my grandmother's voice rising up, talking about the power of joy too. So I hear that. I hear that.
And whenever grandma shows up, all can be well.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right.
I'm going to move us along. There's a question in the chat from Ann Ridge, and then Arlisha Corley has her hand up. So we'll take Ann's question first, and then Arlisha, I'll turn to you. Ann asks, she says, there are 20 unhoused person encampments in Chicago. How can the chaplaincy pastoral care movements you are describing serve these communities?
For me, the greatest chaplain that I see today, that I admire so much, and I'm intentional when I use this language about him, is Dr. William Barber. Is just a prolific and prophetic chaplain today, and I call his name in these moments because I feel like he really exemplifies what does it mean to be a pastoral presence that is also ignited by a social justice fire in the ways in which he provides spiritual care to people today. And so I really think chaplaincy looks like, how are we going to our legislators, our congresspersons, our political officials, and advocating for change around housing and other sociological ills that exist. I'm really pushing us to think about chaplaincy outside of the walls of a faith community, chaplaincy outside of the walls of a healthcare institution, chaplaincy really outside in the public sphere, if you will, and how it connects to political legislation, if you will.
Yeah, I agree. There's I was just working with the Harvard chaplains yesterday on this annual event that we do, which is Thanksgiving meal packing, putting together meals that go out to people all over the region who are food insecure. And this tension that always arises between us, needing to do that because people need the food, and also needing to go upstream a bit and figure out why people are food insecure, and what we serving this extraordinarily powerful institution, which in some ways, has helped to invent the economic context in which we live with people in food insecurity, what we can do to move upstream in that too. And the need to do both, to serve the people whose lives are in the precarious situation in the moment, and to work like Dr. Buhuro says, with legislators and things of that nature. But I think that there is a powerful notion that we need to grapple with as churches that have been following this prophetic command to speak truth to power. That at some point we have to recognize in our political situation that the powerful don't necessarily want to hear the truth, or that they already know the truth and they don't care. Miguel de la Torre has been talking about this recently in several spaces that I've heard from others about. And I think that there is something really powerful about changing our orientation to speaking truth to power, and beginning to recognize that for many in power, there are disposable people. And there is really no concern for whether they live or die. And that is the truth that needs to be confronted. And how we do that as congregations, I think, will change the way we engage in activism and justice work. And it's harder, I think, than it used to be. There was a time when demonstrating and marching and protesting and writing could almost shame politicians into doing the right thing. And I don't think that is as possible anymore. There seems to be very little shame in politicians really believing that there are people who don't matter. And what we do about that, I think, will shape how we engage in that kind of justice work for those whose lives are pushed to the edge. And for De La Torre, I'll say, and for some others, you know, any hope in that begins in the experience of the marginalized and in the experience of hopelessness, and attending to the lived human reality of that, and the movements that are going on in that situation should be instructive to us in how we build movements of justice and care.
I just wanted to make one little brief interjection that those of you who study chaplaincy studies here at CTS already know about our commitments in these regards. But for those of you who haven't been in those learning communities, I just want to say really clearly that one of the very necessary acts of reparation that needs to take place in our very understandings of what spiritual care, pastoral identity is really about is rethinking and reclaiming what is often split between pastoral and prophetic. And in our introduction to chaplaincy studies class here at CTS, the persistent, inescapable question that's put to every one of the contributors into that conversation is, how is your work justice work? That we would not for 1 minute think that chaplaincy is limited to empathetic listening or having a good word for somebody who needs it. That if you are not tuned into and sincerely engaged with the justice dimensions, not only of that one-on-one encounter, but the very context and systems of power in which you are working, that is not sufficient. It is not sufficient to just hold somebody's hand while they cry, or even go so far as these educators have just suggested, and we should hold some space for folks to be angry. If you're gonna hold space for somebody to be angry and not take their anger seriously enough to be about the justice work that will be a balm to that anger, that is insufficient, right? We have to be able to understand our work with greater complexity, with greater dimensionality. And I just wanted to make sure that we were bridging those gaps in this conversation. This is not just conceptual work that we're talking about here. This is the necessary work that we're really talking about in terms of chaplaincy. So Anne's question and the responses that you've just heard are all really tuned into where should chaplains be? Exactly. And what does it mean to be in those spaces with a mindset of what the kind of chaplaincy that we're talking about here, and what's the responsibility and what's the real agency of that work as well. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of you for those, for your responses, and thank you, Anne, for the question. I'm going to keep moving us along because Arlicia has had her hand up for a long time. So let me turn to you, Arlicia. We'll take your question now.
Thank you very much. And thank you, presenters. I just wanted to ask a question in line with social media, which is one of the areas that I kind of focus on a lot myself, particularly the crowd mentality of bad theology that was presented earlier. And getting people to the point where I guess they hit a point where they're lamenting and they're hurting in pain. They often do that with a crowd of people. And I was just wondering, what would be your suggestion? I mean, I've talked to a lot of people online in teasing them to a direction where they can get some type of pastoral care, because some of them are really seriously in need of pastoral care, and they don't seem to be able to shake themselves from the group mentality that's kind of tossing around bad theology, and that's experiencing a lot of pain. So if you have any suggestions about that, I would appreciate it.
Thank you. There's a couple of dynamics in your question that I grapple with. Number one, I love social media because it is community oriented, and as a person of African descent, it reminds me of the ways in which whenever there was a challenge that a member of my own family wrestled with, we all gathered at grandma's house, and grandma put on a cup of coffee on the stove, and we all sat around, me, my aunties, my mom, my cousins. We all sat around the kitchen table and we talked until we figured it out. And then the person left and we all left, right? And so in some sense, I experienced social media as being that. And so I appreciate the communal aspect of social media. I think it's necessary. I think it's needed, and I don't want to do away with it. And so I love the idea of having us as spiritual care providers or chaplains in digital space thinking about what are the ways in which when someone posts a particular statement, sharing their feelings, how do we move to simple statements that we place now in the comment section, like, you know, I hear you. I see you. I totally connect with what you're saying. I've at one point experienced that as well. Your feelings are valid. Your feelings are honored. The act of me, for example, responding that way in your comment section of your post not only sends a message to you, the person making the original post, but it also sends a message to the entire community, right? Because the community is watching. All eyes are watching in that space. That's all of us gathered around the kitchen table, having a moment, so to speak, if you will. Also, if I could be so bold to say, what does it mean for me to sit comfortably in one naming those feelings without desiring to shift them? So when I feel the need, because I was born and raised Baptist, as my mother says, even though I'm UCC now, my mother reminds me of you as a Baptist born and a Baptist bred. And when you die, you be a Baptist dead. So there's the Baptist part of me that wants to immediately move to say, it's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. But then how do I challenge my own self in those moments to say, no, Danielle, pause. Reflect on what's going on for you in these moments that you want to shift them. How do I, as the pastoral care provider or spiritual care provider in digital space, speak to my own anxiety that says, oh no, I need to shift you to making a quote unquote positive statement. I think that's also important for us in some sense, to speak to our own anxiety that tells us, oh no, you got to shift that person, if that makes sense. How do I even reject what I sense is the ways in which I've been trained wrong in ministry, right? I was trained in ministry that, oh, if somebody's feeling bad, you got to shift them. And so what do I do to resist that bad training that has been indoctrinated in me for the last 20, 30 years from my own upbringing? How do I shift that, start to shift that perspective and resist those ideologies that have been implanted in me, and say, you know what, you can post that you're upset, and I'm gonna say, yeah, I feel you. I'm pissed too, and then I'm gonna move on and do something else, and that's okay.
I'll just name one more example of sort of a digital social media example of spiritual care that I've seen recently from a colleague that meant something to me, at least. It's a little different context. Nobody was posting and she was responding to it. But I know that this particular minister has been doing a lot of response and advocacy around some very anti-LGBTQ stuff that's going on right now at Samford University in Alabama. And the other day I saw her post on her on her Facebook wall. Just she's a pastor of a church in the South, and she just posted a little, I don't know, paragraph or so about her her standing in solidarity with LGBTQ people, and said, you know, if you're a queer or trans person and you want to talk to me as a pastoral figure, message me, and I'm glad to set up a time, you know, wherever you are in the country. And it seems like a really small thing, but as a queer person who grew up in the South and grew up in a situation where I had no one to talk to about my queer experience, that meant a lot to see. And now, as a very openly queer minister, public figure, I cannot tell you how often I get messages from queer people all over the country reaching out to say, I'm looking for X, Y, or Z resource. Can you help me? I need to talk to my family about this. Do you know someone I can talk to, or whatever? So I think making oneself available in ways that one is able to be available to others in that kind of public social media sphere can have a real impact on people who need someone to talk to, but didn't know necessarily that you were someone that they could reach out to and talk to about whatever this experience is.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions, comments? We have about 10 minutes or so left before we'll have to start wrapping up. Well, then I'll ask a question. So with the timing of this, so this, if I'm remembering correctly, this project got underway in like June of 2020. June of 2020. Just take yourself back. I'm in Chicago. We were on pretty much lockdown here, right? It was a scary, scary time. So my question for each of you is, how did you care for yourself as you were trying to, at the same time, sort of think about the larger question of what's going on in the world and what's the impact of the world? Like, you're also having your own experience of dealing with all of the pandemics, not just the virus, right? So that's my closing question to all three of you.
Yeah, I'll say briefly, one of the contributors to this series, not either of the folks you're hearing from today, you know, when I reached out to them and I said, you know, would you lend your vision and your voice to this? You know, that conversation started with just exactly what Lisa has asked. You know, we were just checking in with each other, two colleagues talking to one another. And at the time that we were having that conversation, they were putting on gloves when the mail arrived at the apartment and putting the mail in the microwave. Right? Like that's where we were at that time in the pandemic, was microwaving our mail because we thought that maybe that was going to be something that was going to keep us safe. And I think this is so crucially important because I'm so aware of the tension that just dwells among us in higher education. And we are certainly no more enlightened in theological education for this, that at times of this kind of profound impact, many of us, students, teachers, any of us, you know, we go to a thinking place, right? We're trying to make some sense of this. And one of the things that both Dr. Buhuro and Dr. Sanders have really reminded us of so clearly is that we can't actually think clearly if we're not really attentive to our whole selves and our big selves in this, right? There isn't a way for us to escape these very real circumstances by thinking our way out of it. And that's a little countercultural in this academic space, right? I mean, the premise of this whole project would seem to suggest we could just smarten ourselves so smart that we would be protected from these things. And Lisa, you're just right. All of us working on this project together were no less impacted by what was going on. Our families, our neighbors, our communities, our very selves were feeling this. And that has to be that way, because if we're going to have something useful to contribute by way of resourcing to the people around us, we have to not remove ourselves from it, but rather allow ourselves to speak from a place of recognizing the impact that's happening for us. So the work that you're going to find in this series, this community project, it's not some, let's climb up the hill and look down, upon what's happening down there, and we'll just figure it out for ourselves. I mean, you're seeing really brilliant folks who are really doing the labor of bringing that brilliance to these challenges. But we're not removed from these challenges. We're living in these challenges, and we're imagining that scholarship, again, has some purpose for us in a present tense, not just in a look back and talk about it kind of way. And so the folks who are here are scholars like that, and they're brilliant like that. And maybe we'll be wise in some ways 10 years from now, and maybe we can't wait that long. Maybe we can't wait until we feel safe. Maybe we got to speak the truth right now. Maybe we can't wait till we have all the answers and all the wisdom and all the maturity. Maybe we need to get ourselves into this conversation now. And that really has been, Lisa, what this project was really born from. So thank you for asking that question. And I would love to hear from my colleagues on this, of course, as well.
I think for me, there was an opportunity that I discovered to develop relationships with the more than human world around me. I mean, my dogs are obviously really important parts of my relational life and sustaining me through the pandemic and a whole lot of other things. But even beyond, our household pets, I live across the street from the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, and being able to spend time among the trees when it was not safe to spend time among people helped turn me toward other forms of relationship that I found sustaining. And I really like what Dr. Moon said about, maybe in 10 years we'll figure things out, but right now we have to kind of try things out. And I kind of took an experimental approach to that with my congregation too, and invited them through various sermons and things to develop relationships with the more than human world. And in the same way that I found it meaningful, a lot of my congregants would report back that, they've been taking a walk every day in the same route, and they've developed a relationship with this particular oak tree on their walk that they've passed by every day for most of their adult lives, but they've never stopped to commune with it before or to know anything of it. And those relationships with the more than human world became really important to some of them too, as they were for me.
I have been reflecting on the work of Dr. Lee Butler. He recently penned a book, Liberating Our Dignity, Saving Our Souls. And in the book, he has a phrase, crisis breeds creativity. And so that phrase has stayed with me since the onset of COVID-19. Crisis breeds creativity. And so I began to, in my own life, personally and professionally, wrestle with, in the midst of this new pandemic, what is my new identity, and how do I be creative around that? And so I began to grapple with two reflective questions. Number one, what is the divine calling me to be? And what is the divine calling me to do? And so that was most helpful for me. I got to really grapple with that. It's in the middle of a pandemic when I felt called to start an online CPE program. And so I feel like that becomes the question that many of us have to ask ourselves. How are we called to be creative in the midst of this crisis? What are we called to be? What are we called to do?
Thank you, all of you, for your thoughtful answers and for this wonderful dialogue. I would encourage everyone, we've got just a little bit of time left. I've got a couple of announcements to close us out, but before then, if we can show some affirmation and some gratitude to our featured speakers today, Drs. Buhuro and Sanders and Moon. There we go. Yeah, high five them, offer some snaps or claps, or put your emojis in there, throw it in the chat. This was a wonderful discussion. I'm glad that we extended our time so that we could really engage with all three of you. Many, many thanks for your time, for your hard work on this project. Zachary, for your work in being the editor of this larger project. So it was wonderful to be with you all today. Couple of quick announcements with some things coming up at CTS that no one wants to miss. Next week on the 13th of October, we welcome as our Rook speaker, Dr. Aubrey Hendricks. That event will take place at 6 p.m. It is a virtual event. If you register for it, you will get the link. And I'm hoping that my colleague Brendan will drop the oh my gosh, Haley is so fast. The link is in the chat. So if you haven't registered yet, the event is free. We encourage you all to be there. It will be an amazing event, as our Rooks lectures always are. You may recall, I hope that you recall, we're doing Wednesday gatherings, first Wednesday of the month virtual, third Wednesday of the month in person. So we meet on the 19th of October, which is a Wednesday at 12 p.m. at CTS. We'll gather in the chapel. We are welcoming Vincent Alaz Mohammed, and we'll be engaged in a drumming workshop. So the title of the workshop is The Rhythm of Love, Connecting Multiple Hearts Through a Shared Experience, using West African percussion as a vehicle to join us in a collaborative rhythmic experience. Alaz will lead us. So if you're in Chicago, please join us at noon in the chapel. It's followed by community lunch. If you're not in Chicago, then definitely join us for Rooks next week. And then we'll be back here on the first Wednesday of November, which is November the 2nd at noon Central Time. I look forward to seeing all of you at many of those events, and wish everyone peace and blessings. Lashana Tova to all who are celebrating Yom Kippur. It's always a pleasure to be with you all. Take good care, friends. Bye.
Bye.